There is a chapter of human history that does not belong to us. It lies somewhere behind the horizon of memory, beyond the reach of archaeology, and yet close enough that something inside us still trembles when we feel its shadow. You can sense it in the world's oldest myths, in the strange precision of ancient tablets, and even in the quiet intuition that humanity once lived through a story greater, darker, and older than anything we call history. Tonight we step into that forgotten chapter, a chapter carved not in parchment or ink, but in fire, stone, and clay. And as we walk deeper into it, one question rises like a distant echo from the ruins. If a civilization was erased 13,000 years ago, how much of its memory should still remain today? A few myths, a handful of symbols, or nothing at all? Before we move forward, imagine this: a world that believed itself eternal. Cities perhaps not like ours but organized, ritualistic, structured. People who watched the sky not for wonder, but for warning. Generations who felt the pulse of nature with a sensitivity we no longer possess. And then imagine all of it gone. Not slowly, not gracefully, but violently. Imagine the kind of violence that does not simply break a civilization but buries it so deeply that only faint whispers survive, masked as legends of gods, giants, or kings who lived impossibly long lives. What if those whispers were not lies? What if they were memories warped, fragile, but real? This journey begins with a simple but unsettling truth. Every ancient culture on every continent remembers a world-ending disaster. Floods that swallowed coastlines, fire that fell from the sky, darkness that lasted generations, creatures that vanished overnight. They remember a time when humanity almost disappeared, when the world reset, when something powerful and terrible forced our species to begin again. But what makes this collective memory extraordinary is not its existence, but its consistency. How could so many unrelated cultures have remembered the same catastrophe unless they were all survivors of the same event? Unless the story was not a myth, but a wound. The first line of our forgotten chapter begins long before recorded history, thousands of years before the first Sumerian scribe pressed his stylus into a wet tablet. It begins in an age we now call the late Pleistocene, at a moment when the world was colder, harsher, but stable enough for early humans to carve out lives rich with ritual and meaning. And then, with almost no warning, the sky broke open. Something entered the atmosphere, something bright, fracturing, violent. It did not strike the earth as a single object. It disintegrated into a storm of fragments, each one carrying the force of a detonating star. Firestorms ignited across continents, ice sheets melted and then refroze, rivers changed their course, entire ecosystems collapsed, and humanity, fragile and scattered, stood face to face with extinction. This was the Younger Dryas Cataclysm, the event that archaeologists only recently recognized, but ancient storytellers never forgot. For them, it was the flood that swept over, the night the sky burned, the wrath of the gods, the purification, the agending fire. They encoded the memory in myths, in stone circles, in engraved pillars, in rituals meant to warn future generations. But memory is slippery. Over time, truth bent into symbolism, and history became mythology. The survivors rebuilt what they could, but they also carried the trauma of a world that vanished beneath their feet. That trauma shaped cultures, shaped religions, shaped kingship. And somewhere in that shattered world, a lineage emerged, one that claimed descent from beings older than mankind, beings who were remembered as teachers, judges, architects. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki. But before we go to them, we must understand something deeper. The survivors of the ancient cataclysm were not simply rebuilding a damaged world, they were trying to resurrect a forgotten one. Their monuments suggest a memory older than their tools. Their symbols hint at knowledge older than their cities. Their stories speak of rulers whose lives stretched not decades but millennia. And their most haunting belief was that kingship itself descended from heaven, not as a metaphor, but as a memory of a time when rulers carried a heritage no longer found among ordinary humans. This idea of a lineage separate from humanity, older, wiser, fading with each generation, surfaces again and again across early civilizations. The Egyptians spoke of the Shem-Suhor, the followers of Horus, who ruled before the dynastic kings. The Greeks remembered the age of Titans, beings of immense power, overthrown before mortal kings arose. The Maya told of the first people of the dawn, whose knowledge surpassed their descendants. The Sumerians preserved the most explicit version, kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years before the flood, and one king who emerged right after, carrying both the memory of the old world and the destiny of the new. His name appears in the oldest story ever written, not at the beginning of the world, but at the beginning of its rebirth. Gilgamesh. It is no coincidence that his epic opens not with creation or triumph, but with a city whose foundations rise from the ashes of a fallen age. Uruk, a city that should not have existed as early as it did. A city built as if its founders remembered something no one else did. A city whose walls and temples and administrative systems appeared, not like inventions, but like restorations, reconstructions of a blueprint preserved through catastrophe. And standing above those walls, both within the story and within the archaeological record, is the king whose bloodline the scribes insist was two-thirds divine. At first glance, this ratio seems poetic, but the Sumerians were not careless with numbers. Their mathematics were precise, deliberate. If they meant half, they would have written half. Instead, they wrote two-thirds, a value that does not appear anywhere else in their king lists, genealogies, or myths. It is unique, it is intentional, and it is a clue pointing toward a lineage that straddled two worlds, the world before the Cataclysm and the world after it. As we step deeper into this story, as we unravel clay tablets, ruined cities, and ancient memories, one question will follow us like a low hum beneath the narrative. What exactly survived the Cataclysm? Not just people, not just stories, but knowledge. Knowledge older than the cities that recorded it, knowledge older than the civilizations that inherited it, knowledge that may have flowed through the veins of one man, the last Anunnaki king, before disappearing forever into the dust of time. If the first lines of our forgotten chapter whisper of a world erased, then the second line reveals the lone figure who stands at its threshold, man suspended between legend and flesh, myth and history, memory and loss. His name appears in nearly every discussion of ancient Mesopotamia, yet the story we are taught about him in school is only a faint shadow of the one carved into clay. He is introduced to us as a hero, a demigod, a wanderer seeking immortality, but the tablets themselves paint a different portrait. They describe him as a king, a conqueror, a witness to a world rebuilt over ruins no one dared to explain, and buried beneath the poetic veneer of his epic lies, the role he truly played, the final heir of a lineage that did not survive the flood, the last sovereign of an age that ended 13,000 years ago. It begins with a simple question, a question the ancient scribes ask, not with hesitation but with unyielding clarity: who was Gilgamesh? To us, he is a literary figure. To the Babylonians, he was an archetype, but to the Sumerians, the people closest to the Cataclysm, he was real as their kings, their temples, their taxes. He appears in administrative tablets, not myths. His name is written beside construction records, not creation stories. In one fragmented text, his son helps rebuild the Temple of Nineveh. These are not the details of a fictional character. These are the mundane fingerprints of a man who walked, ruled, and shaped the early world. Yet beneath this historical certainty lies the mystery that has haunted scholars for centuries. The scribes insist he was two-thirds divine, one-third mortal. It is tempting to treat this ratio as metaphor, but the Sumerians were not storytellers, inventing grand imagery to embellish their kings. They were record keepers, precise, mathematical, almost obsessive in their structure. Their entire administrative system ran on base 60 calculations. Their star charts were accurate to a degree modern astronomy once dismissed as impossible. They did not casually invent numerical lineage, they encoded it. So what does two-thirds divine actually mean? And why does this fraction appear nowhere else? Not in any other king list, not in any genealogical tablet, not in any religious hymn. Why is it reserved for one man and one man only? To the Sumerians, divine did not mean omnipotent or celestial in the modern sense. It meant belonging to a class of beings older than human memory, a lineage that predated the flood, a group the later scribes called the Anunnaki. These beings were not extraterrestrials descending in spacecraft, nor gods residing in unreachable heavens. They were culture bringers, architects, judges, rulers, sages, whose presence defined the world before the Cataclysm. When the flood swept over, their era ended, but fragments of their bloodline, fragments of their knowledge, fragments of their memory, persisted in a handful of post-cataclysmic rulers. Gilgamesh, according to the scribes, was the last of them. His mother Ninsun is explicitly described as a goddess, one of the Anunnaki, associated with wisdom and counsel. His father, Lugobonda, appears in both myth and administrative records. A king assigned a semi-divine status that makes sense only when we view him through the lens of a lineage transitioning from pre-flood to post. The ratio two-thirds divine reflects, not metaphorical greatness, but a genealogical structure, one fully divine parent and one partially divine parent. This interpretation explains why no other Sumerian king receives such a designation. After Gilgamesh, the lineage fades. Kingship becomes fully human. The ancient world closes a door, it never reopens. But why cling so fiercely to this memory? Why emphasize the divine ancestry of a king ruling several generations after the flood? Perhaps because the people of Uruk believed Gilgamesh was not simply their ruler, but their last connection to a world whose ruins they still walked among but no longer understood. The flood had taken more than lives. It had taken continuity. The past was a broken mirror, and Gilgamesh was the final shard that still reflected the age that came before. To understand the weight of this role, imagine living in a world rebuilding itself from the ashes of a forgotten age. Imagine temples rising atop foundations older than their builders knew how to date. Imagine workers excavating stones carved by hands they could not identify. Imagine the confusion of inheriting knowledge without context, how to administer grain rations, how to align buildings with the stars, how to measure time, how to fire clay tablets so they would endure for millennia. To the survivors, These skills must have felt like remnants of a memory, not their own. And standing at the center of that confusion was a king who belonged half to their world and half to the one before it. This is why the Epic of Gilgamesh is not just a story of adventure, but a story of identity. A man with divine blood ruling a human world. A king who remembers something he never lived. A ruler who feels the grief of an age lost long before his birth. His tyranny at the beginning of the epic is not the cruelty of a despot, but the restlessness of someone carrying a burden too old, too heavy, too unclear. His fear of death is not the fear of a mortal man, but the terror of someone whose ancestors were not meant to die as humans now do. His quest for immortality is not an act of arrogance, but a desperate attempt to preserve the last thread linking two worlds. In this light, the epic becomes something more than literature. It becomes a psychological record, the internal conflict of a man who embodies the fracture between the pre-cataclysmic and post-cataclysmic ages. Each step he takes, each battle he fights, each god he defies, reflects the struggle of a lineage being forced into extinction by the tides of time. And his inevitable failure is not a defeat, but a truth. The old world could not survive in the new one. Gilgamesh is not remembered because he conquered kings or built walls. He is remembered because he was the last, the final echo of divine ancestry, the last sovereign whose blood carried the memory of a world erased, and the first king of the world reborn after it. Before we follow Gilgamesh any deeper into the fractured memory of the ancient world, we must understand the event that shaped him long before he drew his first breath. Because his story, his divinity, his fear, his legacy cannot be separated from the wound that split human history into two unequal halves. It is the wound that ancient scribes tried to encode into clay, that myths cloaked in symbols and gods, that scientists only rediscovered in the last century. The Younger Dryas Cataclysm, the night the sky fell, the day the oceans swallowed the earth, the moment humanity almost died. Imagine the world as it was 13,000 years ago. Ice sheets the size of continents towered over the northern hemisphere. Rivers crawled through plains now buried beneath cities. The people of that era lived in scattered clusters, hunters and gatherers whose lives followed the rhythm of the land. Yet these were not simple people. They studied the sky because the sky was a calendar, a teacher, a warning. They tracked the seasons, the migrations, the stars. They knew that survival meant understanding the subtle tremors of nature. And then, one day, every tremor became a scream. Something entered the atmosphere, something bright, something ancient, something that had wandered the cosmos long before humans even existed. A comet, perhaps, or a fragmented swarm of celestial debris. It shattered into dozens of fiery pieces, each one tearing through the air with the force of a nuclear blast. Some exploded above the ground, turning forests into instant firestorms. Others struck the ice sheets, vaporizing billions of tons of water in seconds and sending shockwaves across continents. The sky burned with a brightness no myth can adequately describe. Ancient storytellers, lacking the vocabulary of modern science, described it the only way they could. The gods were angry. But anger is a human word. What happened was not anger. It was physics. The heat of the explosions ignited forests across North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. The soot rose into the sky, forming a planetary cloak that blocked the sun. Temperatures plummeted. Animals that had survived thousands of years of cold suddenly vanished. The mammoth, the mastodon, the saber-toothed cat, the giant ground sloth creatures that had dominated entire ecosystems died out almost overnight. And when the ice sheets collapsed, walls of water surged across land, drowning coastlines and erasing entire cultures. To the survivors, this was not a climate event. This was the end of the world. This moment the Younger Dryas boundary left behind a black layer in the soil, a thin band of ash and impact material that appears across vast regions of the planet. Inside this layer, scientists have found microscopic diamonds forged by sudden, catastrophic pressure. They found metallic spheres created by vaporized Earth cooling into droplets. They found rare elements common in comets, but scarce on Earth. Every clue pointed to the same thing. An impact so violent, it reset the climate for more than 1,000 years. But long before scientists pieced together this evidence, ancient peoples had already recorded it not in equations or geological charts, but in stories. The Sumerians remembered a great flood that ended an age of impossible kings and birthed the first human dynasties. The Egyptians told of Zep-Tepi the first time, when the gods ruled before a calamity forced humanity to begin anew. The Greeks recounted the funeral of the Titans, swallowed by floods and fire. The Maya described a sky serpent that struck the earth. The Hopi spoke of worlds destroyed by fire and ice. The Norse wrote of Ragnarok, when flames consumed the sky and oceans rose to swallow the land. Different names, same memory. To the modern mind, myths are symbolic. To the ancient mind, myths were memory distorted, retold, reshaped, but still rooted in truth. And the truth they preserved is this. Humanity lived through an extinction-level event. Most of the world died, but not all. Somewhere, scattered across continents, small groups of humans survived. And among them, if the oldest traditions are to be believed, were individuals who saw the catastrophe coming. Individuals who preserved fragments of knowledge, fragments of culture, fragments of a world older than we can imagine. These survivors would become the seeds of the first post-cataclysmic civilizations. They would carry forward the memory of the lost world, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to rebuild, enough to form the first cities, enough to create writing, ritual, astronomy, enough to inspire the earliest stories of gods who once walked among humans. This is the world Gilgamesh inherits. When he climbs the walls of Uruk in the opening lines of his epic, he is not standing at the dawn of civilization. He is standing on the debris of one. Everything around him, the temples, the symbols, the systems, is built upon memories older than his people understand. His scribes, when they describe the flood, are not inventing a metaphor. They are trying to bridge the incomprehensible gap between what they have been told and what they can prove. They knew their ancestors survived something terrible. They knew kingship began again after the flood. And they knew that Gilgamesh stood at the pivot point of a world rebuilt from fragments. This is why the Younger Dryas Cataclysm matters so deeply to his story. Without it, his divinity seems like myth. With it, it becomes context. Without it, his terror of death seems dramatic. With it, it becomes ancestral memory. Without it, the flood in his epic seems symbolic. With it, it becomes the echo of the greatest disaster humanity ever endured. The ancient world did not forget the cataclysm. It encoded it, in stone, in myth, in lineage. And over the centuries, as memory blurred, the people of Uruk looked to Gilgamesh as the final thread connecting them to the world before the sky fell. They saw in him not only a king but a relic, a living bridge between their fragile present and an age erased by fire and water. This is why his story begins with a city and not a creation myth. This is why his lineage is described with an impossible ratio. This is why he searches for immortality, not to escape death as a man, but to escape the extinction his ancestors narrowly survived. His fear is the fear of a lineage that once watched the world end. His quest is the quest of humanity itself, the desperate attempt to understand what was lost and what might be lost again. Because the Younger Dryas was not merely a disaster, it was a reset. And in the centuries that followed, the survivors built the world we inherited. But the memory of the world that came before, the one destroyed 13,000 years ago, remained trapped in the clay, waiting for us to hear it again. If the Younger Dryas Cataclysm was the wound that divided human history into a before and after, then the Sumerian King List is the document that tried against impossible odds to stitch those two worlds back together. It is not a myth, not a hymn, not an epic. It is a record, a ledger, a political archive copied and recopied across more than 1,000 years because the people who preserved it believed, with absolute conviction, that the truth inside it mattered. And like all things crafted in the shadow of vast destruction, it contains fragments of a story too large to fully grasp but too important to forget. At first glance, the King List seems simple, a chronological register of cities and rulers, stretching back into the deep past. But the moment you read it carefully, everything becomes strange. What happened? Why does the list behave as if the fabric of reality were torn in half? The scribes themselves give the answer in a single stark line. Then the flood swept over. No explanation, no elaboration. Just a boundary event that resets the world. The line reads like a guillotine falling between epochs. Everything before it belongs to an age of impossible longevity. Everything after it belongs to an age of mortality. The King List is the only ancient document that treats the flood not as myth, but as a chronological divider. It is history's fault line carved into clay. Modern scholars, uncomfortable with the impossibility of the pre-flood rains, dismiss them as symbolic exaggerations. But the problem is this: the Sumerians did not exaggerate in administrative texts. When they recorded grain deliveries, temple taxes, or construction reports, their numbers were exact. Their mathematics were precise. Their record-keeping was meticulous. Why would the same scribes who counted sheep and barley with obsessive care suddenly inflate kingly reigns into geological epochs? Why would they introduce impossibility into a document designed to establish political legitimacy? Unless the impossibility was the point. The King List is not describing humans. It is describing rulers of a world erased by cataclysm, a world of beings remembered as divine, whose lives followed rhythms humanity no longer understood. These rulers were the Anunnaki, the princely offspring, those of royal seed, not extraterrestrials but the remnants of a lineage that predates the flood. In Sumerian tradition, the Anunnaki oversaw civilization the way elders oversee a household, guiding, teaching, judging, and shaping. They were not gods in the omnipotent sense, but culture-bearers whose memory persisted even as their era died. When the flood came, that lineage vanished, but not entirely. The King List identifies one figure who stands at the precise pivot between two eras. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, listed not among the legendary pre-flood rulers, nor among the fully human kings who follow, but at the beginning of the reborn world. He is the first ruler whose archaeology matches his epic. The first ruler mentioned in administrative documents. The first ruler with a genealogy that includes divinity, not metaphorically but structurally. The last ruler who carries the memory of the old world in his blood. To the scribes, He is not a mythic hero. He is a historical hinja living boundary stone between the pre-flood age of divine kingship and the post-flood age of mortal rule, and he appears in the king list exactly where such a figure should, immediately after the line describing the flood. This placement is not coincidence, it is deliberate. The scribes knew what they were doing. They were telling us that Gilgamesh inherited a world that had just survived annihilation, a world whose rulers once lived according to impossible measures of time, a world that lost its memory in a single generation of fire and water. To understand the weight of this, imagine standing in a landscape where the ruins around you were not built by your ancestors. Imagine knowing that the stones beneath your feet belonged to a vanished civilization, whose language you inherited but whose context you had lost. Imagine ruling a city whose foundations were older than your species' understanding of itself. This is the psychological and historical world of Gilgamesh, and it is why the king list treats him not as legend but as the first plausible ruler after an age of impossibility. Before him, reigns stretch into the tens of thousands of years. After him, they shrink to lifetimes. The scribes were not making a mistake. They were describing a transition. The flood is not a story. It is a dividing line. The king list preserves that division because its authors were the descendants of survivors who needed to make sense of a world rebuilt from fragments. But the king list does something else, something even more unsettling. It implies that history as we know it does not begin at Sumer. It begins after something much older was destroyed. The first cities of the reborn world, Uruk, Kish, Eridu, were not innovations. They were restorations, attempts to replicate structures remembered dimly through oral tradition, ritual, and bloodline. This is why the king list mattered so deeply to the people who copied it. It was not just a political document, it was a map, an imperfect, fragile map of the world before memory. It anchored their identity to a lineage that had nearly vanished, and at the fulcrum of that lineage stood Gilgamesh, the king whose ancestry embodied the pivot from divine to mortal time. When modern scholars ignore the impossible rain lengths, they also ignore the message hidden inside them. Something ended, and something else began. The king list is the clay memory of that transition. Gilgamesh is its human embodiment. And together, they tell us that the flood was not metaphor. It was history. A history so violent that only myth could preserve it tanned. Only clay could survive it. If the king list reveals the fracture where the ancient world split in two, then Uruk is the place where humanity attempted to mend that fracture. It is the city that should not exist, not when it does, not how it does, not with the suddenness or sophistication that marks its appearance on the Mesopotamian plain. In the archaeological record, Uruk does not grow, it erupts. It does not evolve, it arrives. And that arrival is the clearest sign that the survivors of the Younger Dryas Cataclysm were not inventing civilization, they were restoring it from memory. To walk through Uruk as, we reconstruct it from ruins, tablets, and mythos, to walk inside a memory half remembered and half rebuilt. The city spans nearly 6 square kilometers at its height, larger than Athens, rivaling early dynastic Egypt, and yet thousands of years older than both. Long before the Nile raised its pyramids, long before the Greeks carved their temples, long before China formed its earliest dynasties, Uruk stood alone, as the world's first great city. But nothing about its emergence makes sense if we assume a slow, linear development of human culture. Villages do not suddenly manifest monumental architecture. Hunter-gatherers do not spontaneously create administrative systems. Nomadic clans do not wake up one morning and invent writing. Yet Uruk has all of this at once. Start with its walls described in the Epic of Gilgamesh as stretching nearly 10 kilometers, reinforced by hundreds of semicircular towers. For centuries, scholars dismissed this as poetic exaggeration. But excavations revealed layer upon layer of kill-fired brick fortifications so advanced that they rival the engineering of much later civilizations. Who built them? For what enemy? And why would a supposedly primitive society invest such staggering labor into defenses long before warfare reached the scale that would require them? The answer whispers from beneath each brick. The people who built Uruk were not creating. They were remembering. The most revealing artifacts, however, are not the walls or temples, but something surprisingly ordinary. Thousands upon thousands of beveled rim bowls. These simple containers appear across every layer of the early city, yet their uniformity is astonishing. Same shape, same size, same volume. At first glance, they seem insignificant, the disposable pottery of daily life. But their true meaning is far more profound. These bowls were used to pay workers in standardized rations of barley or beer. In other words, Uruk had a ration-based state-organized economy, a system so advanced it would not appear again with similar precision until the great empires thousands of years later. This is not how civilization begins. This is how civilization restarts. Even more startling is the sudden appearance of writing. The earliest clay tablets from Uruk are not primitive pictographs or experimental symbols. They are administrative documents, fully functional accounting systems tracking grain, livestock, labor, trade, temples, and storage. Writing does not emerge here as art. it emerges as bureaucracy, as if the people of Uruk urgently needed to record and coordinate something far more complex than a newly formed society would require. Why would writing appear fully formed? Why would administration precede literature? Why would record-keeping precede ritual? Unless the survivors of the Cataclysm carried with them fragments of an older system, fragments they did not fully understand but knew were essential. Writing, in this view, was not an invention, it was a reconstruction, a memory carved back into clay. At the heart of Uruk stand two monumental temple districts, the Aina Precinct and the Ainu Ziggurat. These structures are far too sophisticated for the era in which they were built. The Ine complex dedicated to Inanna is a labyrinth of ceremonial halls, storerooms, courtyards, mosaics, and shrines constructed with an architectural intelligence that should have taken centuries to develop. Yet its earliest layers are already advanced. There is no learning curve, no architectural experimentation. It appears as if the builders were following plans older than themselves. And then there is the White Temple atop the Anu Ziggurat, built with breathtaking precision atop a stepped terrace long before ziggurats became a Mesopotamian staple. This construction suggests not invention but direction, as if someone remembered how a sacred structure should align with the heavens, how a sanctuary should rise toward the sky, how a temple should serve as both ritual space and administrative hub. Uruk behaves like a city built by people who had seen cities before. This is why the King List places Gilgamesh here not because he founded Uruk, but because he ruled it at the moment when memory and reality intersected, when the past still murmured beneath the surface, when the echoes of a world destroyed still shaped the actions of its survivors. Gilgamesh, born into a lineage that carried fragments of the old world, ruled the first great city of the new one. His reign is not the origin of civilization, it is the bridge, and the city he governs becomes the living testament of that transition. But buried deeper than architecture, deeper than writing, deeper than temples and walls, lies something even more profound. The psychological imprint of a species that has survived trauma. The people of Uruk built quickly because they feared loss. They organized strictly because they feared chaos. They recorded obsessively because they feared forgetfulness. Their entire civilization pulses with an urgency that only survivors understand. This urgency is etched into the epic of Gilgamesh itself, a story whose emotional core is not glory or conquest, but grief for a world already lost, grief for a lineage fading, grief for the terror of mortality. As Gilgamesh walks the streets of Uruk, he is not only a king, he is a remnant, a living reminder of a past the city is trying desperately to resurrect but cannot fully recall. Uruk, in this sense, is more than a city. It is a memory palace, a reconstruction of a civilization that once existed before the Younger Dryas swept it away. And Gilgamesh is the last heir to that memory. This is why Uruk appears so suddenly, why its systems are fully formed, why its architecture has no prototypes, why its writing begins at the level of administration, why its economy resembles that of later empires. The people of Uruk were not inventors, they were inheritors, and everything they built was an attempt, heroic, fragile, incomplete, to rebuild what the ancient fire and water had destroyed. In the shadow of these ruins, one truth begins to crystallize. Civilization is older than history, and history begins where memory fails. Uruk stands precisely at that intersection. It is the stone body of a memory humanity refused to let die. And at its heart stands Gilgamesh, the king who carried that memory in his blood, the last Anunnaki sovereign of a world trying to rise from its ashes. If Uruk is the architectural memory of a world struggling to be reborn, then the Epic of Gilgamesh is its emotional memory, the intimate reflection of what it meant to carry the last embers of a vanished age. And nowhere does this become clearer than in the relationship between Gilgamesh and the being created to humble him. Their story, often treated as mythic entertainment, becomes something far deeper when read through the lens of a civilization suffering generational trauma. It becomes a psychological map of a lineage being pulled apart. One man embodies the world after the flood, structured, fearful, organized, mortal. The other embodies the world before, wild, free, unshaped, untouched by catastrophe. Their collision is not merely dramatic, it is symbolic. It is the meeting of two worlds that can no longer coexist. When the epic opens, Gilgamesh is unbearable, tyrannical, restless, unbalanced, but his cruelty is not the cartoonish villainy of later kings. It is the turmoil of someone who carries a burden his people do not share. A man who feels older than the world he rules. He builds relentlessly, fights compulsively, takes without restraint. He is not seeking pleasure, he is seeking relief. Relief from what? Perhaps the weight of memory. Perhaps the inherited anxiety of a lineage that survived apocalypse. Perhaps the echo of a world in which beings like him were not anomalies, but the norm. The gods, troubled by his imbalance, do not punish him with destruction. They give him a mirror and, born in the wilderness, clothed in hair, drinking with gazelles, running with predators. Enkidu is not a man of Uruk. He is the last remnant of a humanity untouched by civilization. He represents the world that existed before cities, before temples, before rations and writing, before the flood. He is the embodiment of the natural order, unbroken by the catastrophe that reshaped the human psyche. In him lives the innocence of a species that once roamed freely, not yet forced into the hierarchies and anxieties that define the post-cataclysmic world. When Enkidu steps into Uruk, he does not simply challenge Gilgamesh's strength, he challenges his identity. The two worlds collide, they fight, they strain against each other, and finally, they become inseparable. Their friendship is not a poetic flourish. It is the symbolic reconciliation of two human epochs. Through Enkidu, Gilgamesh confronts the piece of himself that belongs to the earth. Through Gilgamesh, Enkidu confronts the reality that civilization cannot coexist forever with wilderness. The harmony between them marks the last moment when the two worlds can meet without destroying each other. Yet beneath this friendship lies a deeper truth. Gilgamesh is terrified of death, not in the way mortals fear it, not as an abstract dread, but as a visceral panic, a hereditary panic, a panic that hints at something embedded deep within him. His ancestors, if the King List is to be believed, lived for thousands of years. His bloodline once belonged to beings whose lives stretched across yet he born into the era after the flood feels mortality creeping into his bones. The world no longer supports those like him. The divine lineage, once vast, is fading. Gilgamesh is the last, and he knows it. But Enkidu does not fear death, not at first. He fears civilization. He fears the city's walls, the loss of freedom, the weight of order. He fears what humanity becomes when it trades wilderness for structure. His fear mirrors Gilgamesh's in reverse. One fears becoming mortal, the other fears becoming civilized. And in this dichotomy, the epic reveals its most astonishing insight. The flood did not merely destroy the world, it reshaped the human soul. The turning point arrives when the two men defy the divine order. They slay Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest, symbol of the old world that humanity was never meant to conquer. They kill the bull of heaven's symbol of the cosmic forces that once governed the earth. They become, for a brief moment, like the divine beings whose memory persisted in their myths. But such power cannot exist in the post-flood world. The gods decree that one of them must die, and they choose Enkidu. His death is not heroic. It is slow, agonizing, terrifying. He curses civilization, curses the harlot who brought him into the city, curses the gods, curses the world that forced him into a fate he did not choose. As he weakens, the wilderness dies with him. His body becomes a funeral for an entire era. When he finally collapses, something breaks inside Gilgamesh. Something ancestral, something ancient, something that whispers, "You are next." Gilgamesh does not weep merely for his friend. He weeps for his lineage, for the divine blood that no longer protects him, for the world that once promised immortality, for the memory of a time when beings like him did not die like humans do. Enkidu's death is a mirror held up to his face, showing him what the flood took from his kind. It is the moment the last Anunnaki king realizes he is mortal in a world rebuilt for mortals. This is why he abandons Uruk. This is why he casts aside kingship. This is why he wanders the wilderness, wearing animal skins. No longer king, no longer divine, no longer whole. His grief becomes a pilgrimage, a descent into realms where the boundary between myth and memory dissolves. He seeks the one person who lived through the flood, the one man granted immortality, the one being whose existence bridges the two worlds, Utnapishtim. But Gilgamesh does not travel like a hero. He travels like a refugee of his own bloodline. Every step is fueled not by pride, but by panic. He is not seeking glory. He is fleeing extinction. His quest is not the search for eternal life. It is the desperate attempt to reclaim what his ancestors lost when the sky fell. His journey beyond the edges of the world, the Scorpion Guardians. The Tunnel of Darkness, the Garden of Gemstones. The Waters of Death is often treated as mythological ornament, but it is something else. It is the symbolic geography of the Cataclysm. Each threshold he crosses echoes a trauma preserved in cultural memory. Fire, darkness, flood, desolation, renewal. Gilgamesh is not merely walking across landscapes. He is walking through the shattered memories of a world that no longer exists. His divine lineage, his fear, his grief, his desperation, they all trace back to the moment the heavens broke and the oceans swallowed the earth. And the lesson he will learn from Utnapishtim is not the one he seeks. It is the one humanity needed to remember. Immortality is not the legacy of kings, but the legacy of memory. When Gilgamesh finally reaches the far shore, he meets not a god, not a celestial being, but a weary old man who carries the memory of a world erased. Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, is not radiant or divine. He is quiet, ordinary, almost disappointingly human. And yet, he is the only being on earth who remembers what the world looked like before the sky fell 13,000 years ago. He becomes the final witness, not only of the great cataclysm but of the beings the Sumerians later called the Anunnaki. And to understand why they vanished and what they truly were, we must follow the story Utnapishtim tells, stripped of later embellishments and misunderstood modern interpretations. Because here, in this quiet conversation, at the edge of the world, lies the clearest clue to the identity of the Anunnaki. They were not aliens. They were not visitors from distant star systems. They were not astronauts descending in fiery machines. The texts never say that. The word Anunnaki does not mean those who from heaven to earth came, as modern fringe theories claim. Its true meaning, preserved in the Sumerian lexicon, is far more grounded and far more revealing. The princely bloodline. Those of royal seed, they were remembered not because they came from the sky, but because they maintained cosmic order, mathematical order, astronomical order, social order, in a world recovering from unfathomable chaos. They were the council of elder beings who held the knowledge that kept civilization aligned with the heavens. And then they disappeared. All at once, like a light extinguished. Why? The answer lies buried in the Sumerian conception of the Mitha sacred tablets, or fundamental principles that governed civilization itself. These were not commandments. They were not myths. They were the foundational technologies and institutions that defined human life. Law, kingship, architecture, writing, agriculture, ritual, justice, measurement. If the world before the flood truly possessed advanced social structures, however we define advanced, then the Me were the fragments of that vanished blueprint. In myth, the Me were guarded by Enki, the wise lord of the deep. In symbolism, Enki represents something else. The guardianship of pre-cataclysmic knowledge. The story of Inanna and Enki, often treated as a humorous myth about drunken bargaining, becomes something astonishing when reinterpreted through this lens. The goddess Inanna visits Eridu, gets Enki intoxicated, and persuades him to hand over more than 100 Me. She loads them onto a boat and brings them to her city Uruk. Scholars interpret this as political imagery, but beneath that imagery lies a deeper truth. The knowledge that shaped the first cities did not emerge spontaneously in the post-flood world. It was transferred, it was preserved, it was carried. The Me are not supernatural objects, they are memories. Cultural DNA, the encoded remnants of the world before the Younger Dryas impact wiped everything clean. And the beings who once protected these memories, those whom later scribes elevated into semi-divine figures, were remembered as the Anunnaki, not aliens, but the last generation of culture bearers, astronomer priests, elders, sages, survivors. The last architects of the ancient world. When Utnapishtim recalls their meeting to Gilgamesh, he does not describe them descending from the cosmos. He describes a council, a debate, a fracture, a decision to reset the world. But in the emotional undercurrent of his story, we sense something else, something unspoken. The Anunnaki could not survive the new world that emerged after the flood. Their power existed only in the world before the ice melted, before the forests burned, before the coastlines shifted, before the atmosphere collapsed. After the cataclysm, the earth belonged to mortals, to humans, to us. Gilgamesh, standing before Utnapishtim, is the last heir of that vanished lineage, the final king with even a trace of divine blood. The King List marks this transition with mathematical precision. The impossible reign lengths end with the flood. Afterward, kings rule for human lifespans. The age of the Anunnaki is over. Gilgamesh stands at its threshold, looking backward even as the rest of humanity moves forward. This is why his fear is so profound. It is not fear of death. It is fear of being the last. The last to remember. The last to carry the ancestral weight. The last to bridge to incompatible worlds. When he begs Utnapishtim for the secret of immortality, he is not asking to live forever. He is asking to preserve the final spark of a dying lineage. He wants proof that his ancestors did not fade for nothing. He seeks continuity, purpose, meaning. But Utnapishtim refuses. Not out of cruelty, but because the world no longer supports beings like Gilgamesh. The blueprint has changed. The cycle has turned. The divine council has dissolved. Yet before he sends him home, Utnapishtim gives him one story, the true flood narrative. The one encoded in multiple traditions across the world. The one that modern geology now supports with chilling precision. He describes a cosmic disturbance, a darkening sky, a storm unleashed by forces too vast for early humans to comprehend. The gods decide to destroy humanity not because of anger but because of imbalance, a metaphor for ecological collapse, population pressure, or global instability. Enki whispers through the walls, warning Utnapishtim, a boat is built, a family is saved, the world resets. This narrative appears not only in Sumer, but in Akkadian, Babylonian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, and indigenous traditions, spanning oceans and continents. All telling the same story, all pointing toward the Younger Dryas. The Anunnaki fade from history after this moment, not because they vanished into the sky, but because their role in the cosmic order ended. Their institutions were shattered, their systems destroyed, their blueprint obsolete. The world born from the ashes belonged to a new species, humans, shaped by catastrophe, adaptation, and resilience. Gilgamesh listens in silence as Utnapishtim finishes his tale. He realizes that immortality was never the inheritance of his ancestors. Their inheritance was memory, knowledge, warning, and that inheritance is not passed through blood. It is passed through story, through clay tablets, through the walls of cities, through the myths that outlast civilizations. When Utnapishtim sends Gilgamesh away, he is not rejecting him. He is releasing him into the world he is meant to rule. A world no longer bound to the divine, but to the human. A world where immortality is earned, not through lineage, but through legacy. Gilgamesh leaves with no magical secret, only the realization that he must carry forward the memory of a world destroyed. He must build something that endures, something that warns, something that survives the next turning of the cosmic cycle. And in this realization, the myth transforms. Gilgamesh is no longer the seeker of immortality. He becomes the preserver of memory. The last Anunnaki king becomes the first human king of the new world. The bridge has closed. The lineage has ended. The responsibility to remember has begun. The world Gilgamesh returns to is not the world he left behind. The journey to Utnapishtim has stripped him of every illusion, his invincibility, his divine privilege, his belief that death is an error rather than an inheritance. Yet what he brings back is something far more valuable than divine immortality. The understanding that humanity, as survival, depends not on escaping death, but on preserving memory. And to understand this, we must peel back the last and most misunderstood symbol of the ancient world, Nibiru. No word from Mesopotamian culture has suffered more distortion in the modern age. Entire industries of speculation, fear, prophecy, and pseudoscience have grown from it. A rogue planet, an impending destroyer, a hidden world returning on a long elliptical orbit, the harbinger of apocalypse. But when we return to the tablets themselves, when we strip away centuries of reinterpretation, we find something far more grounded, yet far more profound. Nibiru is not a planet. Nibiru is not a celestial invader. Nibiru is not a doomsday object in the ancient texts. Nibiru is a location, a position, a crossing point in the sky. The word literally means the crossing, or the pivot. In the Babylonian creation epic, Marduk does not create Nibiru, he assigns its place. He marks it as the point where the paths of heaven and earth intersect. In modern astronomical terms, Nibiru is best understood as a reference to the zenith, the solstitial point, or the cosmic pivot used in ancient celestial calculation. To the Sumerians, the heavens were not a backdrop, they were a clock, a calendar, a vast and precise machine whose cycles governed agriculture, kingship, ritual, and fate. Nibiru was the key that held the system together. It was the cosmic guarantee that order continued, that seasons turned, that the sky was predictable, that the world remained stable. And this reveals the real reason Nibiru mattered so much. Because there was a time when the sky was not predictable, when cycles broke, when order collapsed, when the cosmic machine faltered. That moment is now known in science as the Younger Dryas impact event. The same cataclysm that aligns with the global flood myths and the dividing line in the King List. The Sumerians were not watching for the return of a planet. They were watching for the return of stability after cosmic chaos. Nibiru was not destruction, it was restoration, not fear, but reassurance. The modern fear of Nibiru, a panic that resurfaced in 2012 and every few years afterward, comes from our own confusion. We inherited the terror without understanding the symbol. The ancients did not fear Nibiru, they feared the loss of Nibiru, the moment when the heavens no longer obeyed their own rules. And this fear was not baseless, it came from memory. The Younger Dryas impact broke the sky. Shockwaves ignited global firestorms. Soot darkened the atmosphere. The oceans surged. The Earth's climate reeled. For the survivors, day and night blurred, seasons lost meaning. Cold struck in the midst of thaw. Rivers changed course overnight. To them, the very structure of the heavens had collapsed. When order returned, when the sky became predictable again, and ancient astronomer priests marked that restoration with a symbol, Nibiru, the crossing point. The sign that the universe had regained balance, the reassurance that the terror would not return. This is why Nibiru appears in ritual texts, why it is tied to kingship, why it is associated with Marduk, the organizer of the heavens. It was not a cosmic threat. It was a cosmic compass, a reminder that the world had survived. So how did this symbol become the modern specter of apocalypse? For that, we must return briefly to the 20th century, and the figure who reshaped Mesopotamian interpretation, Zechariah Sitchin. His rereading of the tablets introduced concepts that the original scribes never wrote: Talian minors, interstellar kingdoms, wandering planets. He mistranslated terms, reassigned definitions, and overlaid modern science fiction onto ancient cosmology. Yet his ideas resonated not because they were accurate, but because they touched something instinctual, humanity's deep inherited memory of a world-ending sky. People feared Nibiru because some ancient part of us remembers the catastrophe that reset civilization. Even if the details are lost, the trauma remains. Flood myths, fire myths, sky serpent myths, they are fragments of a psychological wound passed through millennia. Sitchin did not create that wound. He simply gave it a shape, even if that shape was wrong. But when we remove the misinterpretation, when we look again at the clay tablets, we uncover a truth far more meaningful than extraterrestrial drama. The ancients were telling us something simple. The world ended once, it can end again, but knowledge endures if we choose to preserve it. And this brings us back to Gilgamesh, walking through the gates of Uruk for the final time. He does not return triumphant, he does not return immortal, he returns aware. The walls of his city, the ones he once built to intimidate enemies, now appear to him as something far greater. Humanity's attempt to leave a mark against oblivion. The Epic of Gilgamesh ends not with divine revelation, but with a gesture. A quiet, almost tender instruction from a king who has traveled to the ends of the world. Look at the walls of Uruk. He is not boasting, he is teaching. He is telling the future what the past tried so desperately to preserve. These walls are not just fortifications. They are memory, testament, warning. They embody the realization that everything perishes: idiots, kings, civilizations, but knowledge carved into clay can outlast fire and flood. The scribes copied the king list for centuries because they understood this. The builders of Uruk lifted bricks not merely to shelter themselves, but to push back against forgetting. The creators of Göbekli Tepe carved symbols into stone not for ritual alone, but because memory was the only lifeline they could offer to a world that had not yet emerged. Gilgamesh failed to escape death, but he succeeded in achieving something far more important. He made memory immortal. He ensured the world before the Cataclysm would not vanish entirely. He became the bridge between eras, not because of his blood, but because of his story. This is the message at the heart of the epic. This is a lesson hidden beneath myth and archaeology. This is the truth the ancients encoded into clay, so that we thousands of years later might understand. Civilization is not guaranteed. The sky has fallen before, the earth has reset itself before. We are the inheritors of a world rebuilt from ashes, and the only true immortality is the memory we preserve. When Gilgamesh crossed back into the mortal world, something within him had shifted so deeply that even the streets of Uruk felt foreign. The city had not changed. Its walls still towered above the plain. Its temples still glimmered beneath the sun. Its people still carried out their rituals and trade, but Gilgamesh had seen the edge of existence. He had spoken with the last survivor of the Cataclysm. He had witnessed the truth behind myths. He had learned that the divine lineage he carried was not a gift, but a burden, one that tethered him to a world that no longer existed. And now, at the end of his journey, as the desert wind brushed across the stone battlements of Uruk's walls, his mind shifted from cosmic questions to something far more fragile: legacy. Because immortality, the kind he sought, was an illusion, but the traces left behind by those who endure catastrophe, those are real. Those shape the world long after kingdoms fall. This realization opens the final chapter of the myth. Not a story about gods or cosmic cycles, but about humanity's instinct to remember. And to understand this, we must step back from Gilgamesh and consider the landscape of the world he inherited: the post-cataclysmic earth, still scarred by impacts, still mourning the species that vanished, still bearing the black layer of soot that geologists now call the Younger Dryas boundary. It is within this battered world that the earliest forms of civilization not gradually, but abruptly, not hesitantly, but with startling precision. Uruk rises, writing appears. Architecture blossoms, standardized labor systems emerge. The divine councils vanish, and human councils rise. Everything happens too quickly for coincidence, too sharply for accident. Why? Because the survivors carried memory, not complete memory, nothing so perfect, but fragments, patterns, rituals, sky measurements, stonework techniques, principles of leadership. Fragments of fragments, held by a few lineages who belonged to the world before the impact turned the sky black. We see this in Göbekli Tepe, buried deliberately, as if its builders feared the future. We see this in Catalyuk, rising unexpectedly with symbolic art and shared community structures. We see this in early Nile culture, developing astronomical alignment before monumental architecture. We see this in Mesopotamia, where writing suddenly leaps into existence without a slow developmental curve. Civilization did not emerge from zero, it emerged from memory. And among all these memories, none was more important than the warning. The world ended once, it can end again. This is why flood myths echo across continents, from the Sumerian Atrahasis to the Hebrew Noah, from the Greek Deucalion to the Hindu Manu, from the Maya destruction cycles to the Hopi emergence stories. These are not coordinated myths. They are psychological aftershocks, generational trauma encoded into story. The people who lived through the Younger Dryas event did not want their descendants to forget, so they transmitted their fear through images: fire falling from the sky, oceans rising, the earth splitting, the heavens collapsing. They turned catastrophe into mythology so that the memory could survive long after the science was lost. Gilgamesh becomes the emotional embodiment of this transfer of memory. When he meets Utnapishtim, he is not merely hearing an ancient tale. He is receiving a responsibility, a lineage of memory passing from one epoch to the next, a duty to preserve what remains. And that responsibility shapes the rest of his reign. Instead of seeking immortality for himself, he begins building immortality for his people. Instead of trying to escape the human condition, he embraces it. Instead of fearing death, he fears forgetting. This is why the Epic of Gilgamesh ends not with a heroic triumph, but with an architectural gesture. Look at the walls of Uruk. It seems humble, even anticlimactic, but it is one of the most profound endings in ancient literature, because the walls are not just walls. They are the physical manifestation of humanity's refusal to vanish. They represent the first great act of memorialization after the flood, an attempt to preserve stability, order, and identity in a world that had nearly been erased. The walls are knowledge. The walls are memory. The walls are the blueprint of civilization itself. But the story does not end in Uruk alone. The final strands of this ancient narrative reach forward into the modern world, into our fears, our myths, our anxieties about cosmic events, our interpretations of symbols like Nibiru, the panic that gripped millions during the year 2012, the fear of a returning planet or a celestial destroyer, was not rooted in astronomy. It was rooted in memory. Humanity's deepest, oldest memory, that the sky once betrayed us. We feared 2012 because the cycle of fear resurfaced without the context. We remembered the trauma without remembering the story. What the ancients knew intuitively, that the sky could fall, that the earth could reset, returned in distorted form. Modern catastrophism grew from the same psychological soil as ancient mythology, but where our ancestors encoded their fears in poetry and stone, we encode ours in documentaries, predictions, and viral theories. The form changed. The wound remained. This brings us to the final truth hidden beneath myth, archaeology, and cosmic memory. Ancient survivors were not trying to terrify the future, they were trying to prepare it. They wanted us to understand that civilization is fragile, that knowledge must be protected, and that memory is the only immortality we can truly inherit. Gilgamesh, in the end, accepts this. He does not become a god. He becomes a custodian, a guardian of what remained after the Great Reset. He carries forward the final spark of a world destroyed, embedding it into the foundations of a new world that would eventually lead to ours. When future generations copied the Epic of Gilgamesh, they were not copying a tale of heroism, they were copying a warning, a plea, a reminder. Each tablet, each wedge-shaped mark in the clay, was an act of defiance against oblivion. The story survived because the warning survived. The warning survived because the memory mattered, and the memory mattered because the world ended once. Now, in the modern age zarned by technology, cities, data, and science, we often forget how young our civilization truly is. We forget that the world we know rests on the ruins of a world that came before. But somewhere in our collective consciousness, the ancient fear still lingers, whispering the same truth that haunted Gilgamesh. Everything is temporary. Everything can be erased, unless we choose to remember. And that choice to remember, to build, to preserve is the inheritance passed down from the last Anunnaki king. The epic closes not with a triumphant return nor with divine revelation, but with a single, human moment: Gilgamesh, standing before the walls of Uruk as dawn breaks across the plain. The sky glows pale gold. The desert wind whispers along the battlements, and for the first time, he sees his city with new eyes. These stones are not simply defensive walls, they are memories solidified. They are the final inheritance of a world erased 13,000 years ago, carried through fire and flood by survivors who refused to let the past vanish. Here, in the quiet morning light, the true meaning of Gilgamesh's journey becomes clear. He did not fail to find immortality. He found the only immortality that exists, the kind that civilizations carve into clay, the kind that endures in story, the kind that survives catastrophe, the kind that does not preserve the body, but preserves the truth. All around him, Uruk awakens. Markets open, gates rise, scribes walk to their chambers, carrying tablets still wet with clay. Workers gather in the courtyards, priests light incense at the temples of Inanna and Anu. Life, fragile and fleeting, moves forward. And Gilgamesh understands that this simple persistence is itself a miracle, because humanity was not guaranteed to survive the last cataclysm, and it is not guaranteed to survive the next. But survival is not luck, it is memory, it is preparation, it is the willingness of each generation to carry forward the lessons that the last nearly lost. The epic's final message is not about gods or vanished lineages. It is about responsibility. Gilgamesh is the last heir of a world that died and the first king of the world reborn. His reign forms a bridge between epochs, between the divine and the mortal, between the forgotten and the remembered. Through him, the memory of the ancient world is carried into the future. Through him, the knowledge of what came before is preserved long enough to seed what comes after. But the story stretches far beyond Mesopotamia, because the trauma of the Younger Dryas cataclysm did not imprint itself on one civilization alone. It echoed across continents into Egypt, where the followers of Horus were remembered as pre-dynastic sages, into India, where cycles of creation and destruction were recorded in hymns, into the Americas, where sky serpent myths preserved memories of fire from above, into the Mediterranean, where the Age of Heroes sits like a haunting shadow before the great flood of Greek myth. Every culture remembers a beginning that was not a beginning, but a restart, a rebirth, a second attempt. And this is why the Epic of Gilgamesh endures. It is not the story of a single king. It is the biography of humanity itself, told through the eyes of a man who carries the last fragments of an impossible past. A man whose divine blood does not grant power, but sorrow, the sorrow of remembering a world no longer present. We, the descendants of that fragile rebirth, still live in the shadow of the same question that consumed Gilgamesh. How do we ensure that our world is not erased again? Modern science now confirms what ancient myths preserved. A real cosmic event devastated the earth. A real flood reset civilization. A real black layer lies in the ground like a scar across continents. And the survivors, scattered in tiny pockets, carried forward the seeds of the future. Early agriculture, symbolic art, sky observation, the first rhythms of organized society. Their memories became myths. Their myths became epics. Their epics became warnings. Warnings carved into stone temples. Warnings inscribed on clay tablets. Warnings embedded in stories designed not just to entertain, but to help future worlds remember what the last world forgot. Gilgamesh's journey is the emotional heart of that warning. His search for immortality is the human struggle to prevent the past from vanishing, and in the end, he succeeds not by defeating death, but by understanding life. By returning to Uruk and preserving its story, by anchoring the fragile human world to the memory of what came before, and now, thousands of years later, as geologists uncover the signatures of the Younger Dryas, as archaeologists decode the symbols of Göbekli, as scholars re-examine the King List, as astronomers trace the cycles once observed by ancient priests, the pieces of that forgotten world come into focus. Again, slowly, gently, like ruins rising out of sand. The epic closes its final circle when Gilgamesh turns toward the city and whispers something that the tablets paraphrase, but never fully translate, a recognition that knowledge not lineage is the true inheritance of kings. That memory not bloodline is the true divine spark, that the world was not shaped by gods stepping down from heaven, but by humans stepping forward after devastation. And so now, the narrative softens, the pacing slows, the voice lowers, as if the story itself were exhaling after holding its breath for millennia. Imagine standing beside Gilgamesh at the top of the walls. The sun warms the clay bricks beneath your hands. Below, the city moves with quiet rhythm, ordinary lives, unfolding in the shadow of ancient trauma. Gilgamesh watches not with the eyes of a conqueror, but with the eyes of someone who finally understands the value of fragility. The world you see, the one built after fire and flood, is tender, impermanent, yet astonishingly resilient. Every marketplace stall, every carved tablet, every whispered prayer is an act of defiance against forgetting. Humanity's greatest strength is not power, nor lineage, nor divine favor. It is memory, the choice to pass on what matters, the courage to face a world that can end and still build within it. As the wind moves across the fields, Gilgamesh knows his time will pass. His walls will crumble, his temples will fade. His name will shift in pronunciation, in meaning, in myth, but the story, the warning, the memory will live, carried by scribes, preserved in clay, rediscovered in ruins. It will travel across centuries, across languages, across continents, until it reaches us. And now that we hold it, the responsibility passes to us. To remember that our world was built from ashes. To honor the remnants of those who rebuilt it. To preserve the knowledge they died protecting. The last Anunnaki king is long gone, but the memory he carried, the spark of the world before, still glows. Quietly, steadily enough to light the path forward.